lesson we talked about the Constitution of the United States. We're going to talk about another layer of protection that many citizens wanted at the time. We started with the Articles of Confederation. The states had all the power. The federal government really didn't exist. It was more just, we all kind of agreed to be part of one country, but we're going to do things our own way. That didn't work. They wanted a stronger national government, so they wrote the Constitution. This split the power between the states and the national or federal government. It created a strong government, centralized our country, gave the world an impression of what our country wanted to be and planned on being and later became. And it kind of gave an umbrella that all the states could kind of follow the same guidelines. But the states still had a lot of power. Some people thought we should have another layer of protection for the individual citizens. They thought the Constitution gave too much power to the government and the national government, and they wanted individuals' rights to be protected, those rights that had not been protected under the King's leadership in England. When the Constitution was made public, there were supporters and opponents. The supporters were called Federalists. They wanted a federal government. They wanted a strong governing body that would say, okay guys, here's what we're going to do. This is what you have to do, this is what you can't do. Some of these people were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. James Madison, remember, took the notes at James Madison took the notes when they were writing the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. He was a supporter of the Constitution. John Jay was also another supporter. These people wanted a stronger central government. Eventually, the book, The Federalist, was written, kind of gathering their ideas together in one place. Opponents of the Constitution were called anti-federalists. They didn't want a strong federal government. They wanted the states to have the power. Some of the famous anti-federalists were Patrick Henry. Remember, he wouldn't even go to the Constitutional Convention because he thought the Articles of Confederation were just strong enough. We didn't need anything else. We didn't need any more government honing in on our lives and telling us what to do. George Madison and Thomas Jefferson. These people thought that the Constitution was flawed, and they also thought that laws wouldn't work for all states at one time. They didn't think one law would be fair for everyone. They called for a Bill of Rights to protect the individual citizens' freedoms. Patrick Henry was quoting and saying, "Your president may easily become king." And he didn't mean, oh, the president could be king, that's awesome. He meant, this guy that you're holding up and saying, he's our president, he's our leader, could take over and become a tyranny and force his opinions and views and way of life on everyone else and make them go along, just like the king in England had. However, with this debate going on, they still had to talk about the Constitution. It brought a lot of debate in. It changed a lot of how things would have gone. To have the Constitution accepted, we had to have it ratified. 9 out of the 13 states needed to ratify. They needed to sign on and say, we agree with this, we're going to abide by this, we think this should be the vision of our nation. Delaware was the first on December 7th of 1787. Massachusetts almost didn't ratify because there were no Bill of Rights. Then the Federalists pledged Congress would allow additions. They said Congress can add things to it. They can add that Bill of Rights that you guys want. They can add those individual freedoms into the Constitution. But here's a good starting point. Here's a plan. We can change it later, but let's hit the ground running with what we have. Due to the Federalists pledging that Congress could and would allow additions, Massachusetts and 3 other states voted to ratify the Constitution. By 1790, all 13 states ratified the Constitution. The Bill of Rights states the rights of each individual citizen. You, me, your parents, these are what we are entitled as American citizens to have. And we are very lucky to have this. Lots of countries do not have this Bill of Rights. They don't have these things that they are entitled to have no matter what. These were made to protect the rights of all of the citizens of the United States. On September 25th, 1789, a few months after the Constitution took effect, The first National Congress approved these amendments to the Constitution. So the Federalists held up their word. They got these amendments passed in Congress and added to the Constitution. On December 15th, 1791, the Bill of Rights went into effect. So the Bill of Rights was really important to all these people. Let's go ahead and look at exactly what the Bill of Rights tells us we're entitled to as citizens. All right, so there are 10 amendments on the Bill of Rights, and we'll go ahead and look at these amendments by amendments. The first five were really important to the colonists, and they ended up being very important to our country. But the first five were a lot about the freedoms that England had taken away from them, and they wanted to ensure that the people of America would not live under that tyranny again. The First Amendment says the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, right to disagree with the government. So you're free to believe any religion that you want to believe, or no religion at all. You're free to practice your religion. In most countries around the world, that's not necessarily what happens, or especially at this time period. Free speech. You're allowed to say what you want to say. No one's going to censor you. No one's going to say, you can't say that. Okay, well maybe except in school where there's some things we don't say, right? But as a country, we're allowed to have our own opinions, our own beliefs, and to talk about them freely. Freedom of the press. The newspapers can say what they want. They can even write things against the president. In the past, newspapers hadn't been allowed to write against what the government was doing, and this was a big deal. We also had the right to assembly. As long as we make a peaceable assembly, no one's causing problems or starting a riot or screaming and shouting in the streets or burning things or damaging things, you have a right to gather with people and discuss things. That's not always been allowed in history. And you have the right to disagree with the government. No one's going to behead you because you think, man, this law is kind of dumb, or I really don't agree with the speed limit here. I think it should be a little bit higher. Any of those things, you can say what you think about the government. This is not something that had been done in the past. We had kings and queens in the past, for the most part, and it was a new concept to the colonists, starting this new country. They had great plans for us. The Second Amendment gave us the right to own and bear firearms. Remember, the English had kind of controlled them, and they had to rebel and revolt against that, and they needed their own firearms to start a militia. They also needed firearms to eat. They hunted animals. They needed that. They needed to protect themselves. They were in a new country, a new frontier, and they needed to protect themselves from other countries and other natives and animals. They didn't live in big, huge cities where there weren't a lot of animals. They lived kind of on the edge of the wilderness. So firearms were very important in that day and time, and lots of people still take this amendment to heart. They still think that they should really have the right to bear arms and bear and own firearms, because the Constitution and the Bill of Rights allows us to have them. Third, it protects people's rights not to house soldiers during peacetime. Remember, the colonists had to house the soldiers in their houses. They had to take them in and feed them, and maybe giving them the only food they had. Maybe taking food from their children, giving their children a little bit less so that they can feed these soldiers. And that really wasn't fair. They didn't want that to happen to someone else. Fourth, it protects people from having their property unfairly searched or taken. The government couldn't come in and say, hey, you know what? We really need some more iPods. Give me all your iPods. Come on, let's go. They can't do that. They have to have a reason to take something. Now, if they think you're part of a crime, they have reasonable suspicions, they can come in and search your things, and that might happen. But the government can't just take your property unfairly, without due cause, without a reason. The Fifth Amendment, no one's life, liberty, or property can be taken unless decided by a court. You can't be put in jail. You can't lose your freedom. You can't be sentenced to death. You can't have all of your property taken unless a court says this is the sentence for something that you have done. This is what you have to do in repayment of your crimes. This was another big deal. This was a big step forward for the colonists, for the Americans starting their country. They said, we're not going to do that to our citizens. We care about our citizens. We are going to protect them. The Sixth Amendment is the right to a trial by jury and to have a lawyer in a criminal case. So if you are ever charged with a crime, You get to have a jury, and you get to have a lawyer. You don't have to represent yourself. There's not just a judge passing sentence on you saying, well, I just think you're wrong. There's a group of people that have to listen to your story and hear what happened. And there's someone on your side with a lawyer. The Seventh Amendment, in most civil cases, like if you're suing someone, it guarantees a right to a trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment forbids very high bail, fines, or extraordinary punishment. And the Ninth Amendment says that people's rights are not limited to the Constitution. So the Ninth Amendment is trying to help those anti-federalists who said, oh, we don't want the government to be too strong. We want the people to have their rights. We don't want someone to take those away. It's saying, here's what the Constitution lays out. Here's your Bill of Rights that you asked for. Here's things we're definitely going to let our people do. We are not going to infringe on any of these freedoms. But the Ninth Amendment says, if it's not just limited to what's listed in the Constitution. It doesn't mean just because it doesn't say you have the right to own an MP3 player that you can't own an MP3 player. It means you definitely have these rights, and then you have other rights too. It's not going to infringe on those either. The 10th Amendment was also very important to the Anti-Federalists that were afraid of too strong of a national government. It asserts that all powers not stated as belonging to the federal government belong to the states or the people. So if it's not in the Constitution, if it's not in the Bill of Rights, then the power belongs to the states or the people. So then the state government can take control of it, or it's a personal freedom. And that's all we have about the Bill of Rights today. We'll see you next time.